When it comes to testing an MVC application, it's more important than ever that we pay attention to good testing practices. The first thing I want to talk about is the outer layer of testing, or what we sometimes call integration testing. Integration testing is full site troubleshooting. In other words, you're going to take some feature and basically run it from end to end, fill out all the fields, click the buttons to get something done, and make sure that what happens on the screen is what you'd expect. Now, we do want to limit these tests to a specific feature, a specific behavior of the system. We don't want to have integration tests that test, the entire website exactly, because we want to be able to isolate it enough so that if a test breaks, we know what broke. But at the same time, integration tests tend to cover the entire length and breadth of that particular feature, so all the way from the UI down to the database and back again. In order to have a good suite of integration tests, browser automation becomes very important. Now, a lot of times if you have a QA person or a tester or even developers who are doing their own testing, they will open up a web browser and run through the steps manually, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially as you are developing in progress. However, ultimately, what you're going to want is an automated suite of tests that you can run on their own to make sure that nothing broke. And so you don't want to have to keep running these same tests manually over and over and over again. So browser automation's important, and there's a number of tools we can use to automate a web browser in a test framework. One tool is Watton. It is a port of a Ruby library called Water, except it's for .NET, obviously. And this tool will enable you to open up IE or Firefox and execute various actions in the browser, and then check and see if you got the results back you were expecting. Another tool is Microsoft's Coded UI, and so if you have a version of Visual Studio that supports the various testing tools that Microsoft has, then you might take a look at Coded UI. This is more of a playback and record kind of tool, although you can mess with it a little bit, but it is a handy tool as well because it does generate code that you can manipulate. There are other tools out there as well. A lot of them are play and record tools, and it would take too long to list them all, but for Microsoft MVC developers, you tend to run into these two probably more than any other. What are the things you're looking for in an automated test? Well, one of the things you're looking for is performance problems. I mean, obviously, you don't want things to break, but you also don't want things to be slow. And so an automated test can be a good way to pinpoint which areas of your site are maybe running a little slow, especially since most of these tools will show you how long the operation took. You're also looking for security flaws. So if there's a particular page, for example, that requires a certain security level, well, in my automated test, if I just come into that page cold without logging in or anything, does the test still run okay? Because it shouldn't. It should actually tell me that I can't get in because of the security. So that's another thing we're looking for is, can these tests actually get around our security? And then, of course, one of the big things that we're looking for is unhandled errors. Generally, unhandled errors mean unexpected errors, but even if they are expected, we want to make sure that we are handling all of our exceptions. We don't want the user to be confronted with that default, red and yellow screen that has our stack trace on it and stuff. We want to make sure that any common exceptions, or hopefully no exceptions are common, but any exception that is likely to happen if things go wrong, we want to make sure we're dealing with that gracefully. And so automated testing can help us catch all of these things. As we begin to look at integration testing our MVC applications, I want to make it clear that there are a number of tools out there, and even amongst people who use the same tool, they use it in different ways. People have different ideas about how they want to test, and along with that, they have different patterns and practices they've picked up along the way, as have I, that they find that they reuse and that are helpful for the way they like to work. So I just want to start out by saying I'm going to show you the way I like to work with these tools, but that doesn't ultimately mean that this is exactly the way you will want to work with these tools. What you want to do is be absorbing the principles, and the principles will apply no matter what tool you use or no matter what patterns you use. I'm going to be going for pretty basic here, so I highly recommend that if you're interested in this topic or interested in particular tools, that you read some blogs and articles, visit the websites, to see how different people are using these things and the different way they're coding these things to maybe get some ideas about the way that you will want to. What I've got here is a project called Integration Test Demo, but all this really is just the default MVC template. So if you add a new ASP.NET MVC4 project to Visual Studio and you choose the Internet application, this is what you get, and it's a pretty familiar page to most of us that have seen this project before. Now, usually when I do integration tests, I like to write the tests before I actually develop the feature. And there's two main reasons for that. One is that the act of writing the test, if I'm writing those out with, say, a business analyst or a client or a tester or QA person or all those people together in a room, it helps us develop a common understanding of exactly what these features are supposed to do. We all leave this room knowing exactly what's not going to be in the feature, what is going to be in the feature, and how we expect it to behave. And the other reason is having these tests written beforehand sort of serves as a checklist to me. So as I begin to make these tests pass, I know when I'm done. So normally I like to write them first, but for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to write one for an existing feature. And in this case, I'm going to write one for the About page. Somebody comes here, we want to tell them about our company, they click the About link, and here they are. It's a pretty simple feature, but I'm going simple to try to get the concepts across. So I like to keep my tests in a separate project, so what I did is I would right-click on Solution and go to Add, New Project, and I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. I just went Windows Class Library because I've done this a million times, so I'm used to adding exactly what I need. So that'll work just fine. But you may also consider coming down here to Test and selecting Unit Test Project, simply because if you want to use MS Test as opposed to like NUnit or something like that, the Unit Test Project will go ahead and set up MS Test with all the references and configure it for you. Also, if you want to use the Coded UI tool or play around with it, if you have a version of Visual Studio that supports it, this is also where you'll find the Coded UI tests. In my case, I just did the class library, and I called it integration test demo.test.integration. And when you do this, what you want to do is install a few tools. You'll notice I've got Watton down here in my references. What I did is I right-clicked on my project and I went to NuGet, Manage NuGet Packages. And I installed Watton, okay, which you might expect. This is our browser automation tool. And I also installed a tool that I like to use with Watton called SpecFlow. What SpecFlow does is it allows me to write my tests out in English, which is very important when I'm collaborating with others, and then it automatically ties that English to snippets of executable code. So I can write out my scenarios in English and we can all talk about them and agree to them, and then on the flip side I can write a code behind for essentially for those English phrases that will execute my tests. So I tend to use these tools together. If you ever see any of my projects and I've got integration tests in there, you will almost always see these two working together, but that's just me. You don't need SpecFlow to use Watton, and you don't need Watton to use SpecFlow. I just find that they go together really well. So I added both of those through NuGet. A couple of other gotchas that you might want to think about in terms of setup is SpecFlow by default is configured to use NUnit. So if you add a reference to NUnit or add NUnit through NuGet, you should be fine. But you may want to use MS Test, and it's pretty easy. All you have to do is in your app config, after you install SpecFlow, it'll put the SpecFlow section in, just set your unit test provider to MS Test. In fact, it'll even ask you if you want to rewrite any existing code if you've got features already written, and it will actually rewrite them for you to use MS Test. So that's what I did. The last thing, and this is kind of a weird little deal, one of the things about Microsoft Windows is it's kind of weird about threads and who has permission to run what. So when you are running a browser automatically, this can become an issue. One of the things you have to do when you're using MS Test is, one of the references that gets added is this guy, interrupt shutdock. I don't even know how you pronounce that, but one of the things you want to do is to make sure embed interop types is set to false. It'll probably be true by default. And make sure that copy local is equal to true, and then you should be good. You should be all set. So what you want to do when you are ready to write an integration test is, if you use SpecFlow, is you want to right click and go to add and add a new item. And you'll notice I've got SpecFlow feature file, SpecFlow hooks, and SpecFlow step definition as part of my available templates. The way you get those into your own, if they're not there already, is at the Tools menu. If you come down here to Extensions and Updates, you come down here online and you can actually search for SpecFlow. These are add-ins to Visual Studio, and you can install it from right here. Don't confuse that with installing it at the project level. Okay, this installs it into Visual Studio as a Visual Studio integration, but it doesn't actually apply it to any projects. Right-clicking on a project and adding it is what applies it to your project. So at some point you'll probably want to do both of those. But where you usually start out is you go to Add, New Item, SpecFlow Feature File, and you call the feature whatever you want. In this case, I called the feature Viewing About Us Information. And it produces something by default. So just to show you what that looks like, let's say I added another feature file. And let's say I wanted this to be my login feature. So it generates this default little thing for me with some default text. Now I don't actually want this text, I want it to describe my feature. So I might do something like, in order to keep our customer data safe, a visitor should be able to log in. If you're used to user stories, these sometimes make for good user stories. And then your scenarios are going to be little scenarios that illustrate all the things about your feature. So for logging in, a scenario might be logging in with valid username and password. Okay, and you might have another scenario that would be like logging in with valid username but invalid password. And you might have a scenario for forgotten password, and so on and so forth. And as I'm typing these out, SpecFlow is generating this little code behind file that's going to tie executable code to these English phrases. So then you'll notice that they're in a given, when, then format. Our givens are the preconditions. They're the things that happen leading up to the event we're trying to test. When is the actual event that kicks off the functionality that we're trying to test. It's usually going to be clicking a submit button or clicking a link, or something that actually starts the engine running. The thens are going to be the output we expect. What's the end result that we expect to check to make this test pass? So for example, I might have something like given I am on the site and I am not logged in and I provide a valid username and I provide a valid password, when I submit my credentials, then I should be logged in and I should see my profile. Yeah, or something. Okay, so here's all the things leading up to the event that kicks it off. Here's the thing that kicks it off, probably clicking a submit button. And here are the things that we're going to check for. And then we kind of repeat these with the other scenarios. So for example, logging in with a valid name and an invalid password might look pretty simple, except, and I provide an invalid password, then when I submit my credentials, then I should see a failed login message and I should not see my profile. Okay, and so on and so forth. And you're basically spelling out the different scenarios that test this feature. Well, in my case, I have a pretty simple feature. I'm viewing the About Us information. So my feature is, in order to inform the public about our company, a visitor should be able to view About Us information. And our scenario is navigating to the About Us page. There's just not a whole lot of different scenarios that play out with this particular feature. There's really only one. The user goes to the About Us page, and that's really the only way this feature can play out. So it's very simple. Given I am on the site, when I opt to view the About Us information, then I should see the About Us information. Let me go ahead and capitalize this here. Now, the reason I leave the language like this is because I don't want these scenarios to be super tied to implementation. Like when I log in, for instance, I don't necessarily want to say when I click the submit button, because what if I end up making it a hyperlink? Then I'll have to change the test just because I changed it from a button to a hyperlink. So I want to be specific about what's happening, but I don't necessarily want to spell out exactly how it happens. So that's why I don't personally use steps like when I click this button or when I use this drop down. Sometimes I will do that because the test depends on the UI very much, but many tests don't depend on a very specific UI, so if I can leave it open, I will. And that generates some code for us. That's this mismatch back here that you will almost never want to mess with. And this is basically a lot of code that's tying these English phrases into executable pieces. Now these executable pieces are steps. Okay? And the way you make steps is you can actually add these files yourself by right-clicking, going to Add, and selecting Add SpecFlow Step Definition, or you can actually right-click here in your SpecFlow file, say Generate Step Definitions, and it asks you which steps you would like to generate code for, so you can pick and choose if you want. You can pick the name, then I hit Generate, save there, that's fine. Okay. And what it did is it generated steps for me. And they're all stubbed out with scenario context current pending. Okay, so they don't really do anything. But what I'm going to do then is in these little snippets then I can put in the executable code. So for instance, given I am not logged in, I might log out here or something like that. So to illustrate this, I'm going to come back over here to viewing About Us information. I've already generated steps here. I just need to correct capitalization here. So this is maybe a little bit easier to see what's going on. So here's my given, my when, my then. Here's the text that it's matching on, and this text does need to match what I typed in. These method names can be anything you want. I tend to go for the step name, and I usually leave off the givens, whens, and thens, because you might have the same step be a given in one and it might be a then or a when in another one. I also like to use underscores. I don't usually do that in my class names, but here I do, because the readability of these tests is key. It's very key that anybody, whether it's a developer coming to this code for the first time or even a business user, although that's rarer, can come back here and see these tests and know exactly what's going on. So what I've done to help myself out is I've made a little class here called Web Browser. Now we're in Watton World, and what I did is just made a static variable, static property rather, that holds an instance of Internet Explorer, and I store it in the scenario context. So basically I say if the scenario context does not have browser, then make a new Internet Explorer instance and put it in there, and then return whatever's in there. You might think of this as sort of like the SpecFlow session or the SpecFlow HTTP context. It's this thing that exists for the lifespan of a scenario, a little bag that you can put things into. And so I'm just making an instance of Internet Explorer and putting it in here. The reason for this is because this way we can use the same instance of Internet Explorer over and over and over for our tests instead of opening, closing, opening, closing, opening, and closing. For one test, it's not that big a deal, but trust me, when you've got 500 of these guys running at night, you don't want the extra overhead of spinning up a new instance of Internet Explorer for every single test. So that's all I'm doing here. You can run it just fine without it. This is just a little helper class I like to use. So then in my steps, for given I am on the site, I'm going to take my web browser and go to this URL. And of course I can put any URL in here. I could integration test Google if I wanted to, but I don't need to do that. In this case I want to test my application. So I'm going to go here, and this URL is actually my little website here. Okay, this is my home page. When I opt to view the About Us information, so how do I do this? How do I actually view this information? Well, I click on the link, okay, and that link looks like this. It's got the text About in it. So what I did is I said my web browser link find by text About, and this gives me the link, and then I tell it to click. It's that simple. Now, using the link text might not be the world's best way to find this, because that could change, right? I might change this to About Us, and now my test is broken. So one of the things that we might do is take a look and see if there's an ID we could use instead. Okay, and there is not. Okay, right now this is about all I've got going for me. Okay, so there's a few different things I could do. I could say find the link that has this as the href. That's probably not going to change, so that might be a good thing to do. Or I could actually go into my MVC project, add an ID attribute here, and then back here, instead of finding by text, I could find by ID. As you notice here in Find, there's all sorts of things I can use. I can find by name, I can find by SRC if it has one, I can find by URL. There's all kinds of things I can use to find the element that I'm looking for, including the an element name or a selector. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as find by text. Okay, so it's going to look for the link that has the text About, and it's going to click it. Okay, this is browser automation, right? This is integration. And then I should see the About Us information. Now once again, I have to decide what counts as success here, what counts as victory. So when I click About, I want to say, okay, I'm on the right URL, or the page has this title, or something that lets me know that this passed. And so in this case, I'm going to use this text, your app description page. So I'm just going to make sure that the web browser contains the text, your app description page. Now you might argue with me that these are kind of imprecise tests, and you're probably right, but for demonstration purposes this works okay, and it at least shows you the principles of what we're doing. Okay, each piece has an executable step. Watton is going to automate our browser. So when I actually run this test, so I'm going to come up here, I'm going to say run all tests. Now of course it skipped all my login tests because those don't actually have anything in them. But here's my test that passed, the navigating to the About Us page. Okay, and as you can see, it opened up a browser for each of my tests, and here it opened up this one. Okay, this is the one that passed. close these other two windows here. I'll close this guy actually. Okay. Gonna try to run this guy again. I hit run, opens up a browser window, goes to about. A lot of times this happens so fast you can't even see it, and that's actually a good thing. Once again, you can use coded UI, you can use Selenium. I like SpecFlow and Watton because I like writing things out by hand, and I like writing my tests first. But it's not the right approach for everybody, especially for integration tests. So if you like other tools better, by all means, feel free to use them. That's what they're out there for. And even if you like SpecFlow and Watton, there's lots of different ways to code with them. Lots of cool things you can do that I haven't shown you, and lots of patterns you can use to simplify this whole process. So it's a rich field, but the important thing to keep in mind is that we always want to have, in some form or fashion, integration tests, and we really want to strive for automating them.